Hi, I'm Emily Carter. I'm 32 years old. If you like stories about fighting back when everything seems lost, make sure to hit like and subscribe, because this one is about how I was robbed of my inheritance, left homeless, and what I did to reclaim what was mine. They say funerals bring families together, but mine did the opposite. I stood at the very back of the church, near the last pew, fingers clenched around the worn leather strap of my purse. The air smelled like old wood, lilies, and something bitter, regret, maybe, or dust, or both. I was dressed in the only black dress I owned, the one I'd used for job interviews that never led anywhere, the one that now sagged slightly at the waist because I'd lost weight these last few months. Grief does that, even before the person is gone. The casket was closed. That felt wrong to me. Grandpa was always so expressive, full of quiet wisdom and half smiles. He deserved to be seen one last time. But Carol, Aunt Carol technically, insisted on a closed casket, said it was what he wanted. But I never heard him say that. I watched her glide down the center aisle, her navy suit perfectly pressed, pearls sitting just right above her collarbone. She gave the pastor a polite nod, then sat in the front row like the queen of a family I no longer recognized. Her two sons, Josh and Aaron, flanked her like bookends. Both taller than I remembered, both with that same smirk Grandpa used to call entitled on purpose. They hadn't spoken to me in years. Not really. Not since Mom died and I moved in with Grandpa. There was this unspoken understanding, or maybe misunderstanding, that I was the charity case, the failure, the one who couldn't get her life together. Maybe they pitied me. Maybe they resented me. Probably both. But Grandpa never made me feel that way. When I lost my job at the publishing house, when rent got too high and options ran out, he welcomed me with a quiet nod and an extra plate at dinner. We never had to talk about why I showed up on his porch with 2 suitcases and swollen eyes. He just knew. That was his gift. Every morning, he made oatmeal with a splash of honey and cinnamon. Every evening, we watched Jeopardy and kept score like it mattered. He told me stories about his days in the Navy, about Grandma's laugh, about the time he got lost on a fishing trip and came back with nothing but a sunburn and a smile. It wasn't glamorous, but it was safe. It was home. That safety felt shattered the moment I stepped into that church. People glanced at me like I didn't belong. Some didn't glance at all. I tried not to take it personally, but I could feel it, like static in the air. Aunt Carol didn't even nod in my direction. She walked right past me after the service started. Didn't acknowledge me once. Not a look. Not a word. When the pastor invited people to share memories, I stood up. My voice trembled, but I spoke anyway. Grandpa used to say that silence doesn't mean someone has nothing to say. It just means they're choosing their words carefully. He listened more than he spoke, but when he spoke, you listened. I could feel Carol's eyes on me. Sharp, measuring, maybe even annoyed. I don't know what happens next, I added. But I know that I wouldn't have made it these last few years without him, and I'll never stop being grateful. I sat down. No one clapped. That's not the kind of funeral it was. But the silence after felt louder than any applause. When the service ended, people filed out slowly. Hushed voices, awkward hugs, the kind of small talk that feels obscene after death. I waited by the side door, hoping, half expecting Carol to come up and say something. Anything. She didn't. so I walked up to her instead. My hands were shaking, but I tried to keep my voice calm. "I'd like to help with the estate," Grandpa said. She cut me off, clean, practiced, like she'd rehearsed this moment. "Emily, I'm handling everything. You don't need to worry." It wasn't just what she said. It was how she said it. Flat. Controlled. Cold. There was no, "Thanks for being there for him." No. "We'll figure this out together." Just finality. Like a door closing. And not gently. My eyes searched hers for some trace of the woman I used to know. The one who let me braid her hair at Thanksgiving when I was 7. Who brought me pumpkin muffins after Mom's diagnosis. But that woman was gone. Or maybe she never existed outside of my childhood memories. I walked away, each step heavier than the last. The knot in my stomach had formed during the sermon and was now tightening, inch by inch, like a fist clenching around my gut. Out in the parking lot, I sat behind the wheel of Grandpa's old sedan and stared at the church steps through the windshield. People gathered in little clusters, hugging, laughing even. I was invisible, or maybe just inconvenient. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house was too quiet without his humming. Grandpa always hummed while brushing his teeth. A weird, low tune that changed every night, like some secret code only he understood. I missed it. I missed everything. And something about Carol's voice kept echoing in my head. "You don't need to worry." Except I did. Something felt off. Wrong. Crooked. The next morning, I made coffee and stared at the kitchen table. His chair was empty, his favorite mug still in the drying rack. I opened the drawer where he kept his letters, thinking maybe there'd be something, anything written down. A list, a note, a clue. Nothing. But I remembered something he said once, during a Jeopardy commercial break, with a glint in his eye, that I now realize meant more than I thought. "When the time comes, Em," he said, "don't let anyone tell you what you're owed. You already know." I didn't understand it then. I do now. That funeral wasn't just about saying goodbye. It was the beginning of something I didn't see coming. Something bigger. Something buried. 3 days after the funeral, I returned to Grandpa's house with a bag of groceries and a tight feeling in my chest that I couldn't quite explain. Maybe it was the silence I'd been met with at the church, or the way Carol had looked through me like I didn't belong. Or maybe it was just grief still pressing down on everything. It was late afternoon. The sky was gray and heavy, the kind of sky that makes everything look faded. I remember thinking how empty the street looked, how quiet the block felt without Grandpa's laugh echoing from the porch. I climbed the steps, balancing the groceries in my arms. Milk, bread, his favorite strawberry jam, and a little jar of decaf coffee. Old habits die hard. I still bought for both of us. I reached for my key and slid it into the lock. It didn't turn. At first, I thought I'd made a mistake. Maybe I grabbed the wrong key. Maybe the door was stuck. But then I tried again. Harder. I jiggled it. Forced it. Still nothing. I stepped back and stared at the door like it might open on its own. Then I looked down at the groceries in my hands, suddenly too heavy to carry. That's when I noticed the new doorknob. Polished brass, not the old tarnished one Grandpa never got around to replacing. The key I had wasn't just wrong. The lock had been changed. I stood there, blinking, For a second, my brain refused to catch up. This was Grandpa's house. Our house. The place I had cooked Thanksgiving dinner in. The place I'd cried myself to sleep in. The place that had saved me when I had nowhere else to go. And now I couldn't get in. I knocked. Once. Twice. Nothing. No sound inside. No footsteps. I rang the bell, waited. Nothing. My heart started to pound. I set the groceries down and pulled out my phone. My hands were shaking as I scrolled to Carol's number. She picked up after the second ring, her voice as smooth and unfazed as ever. "Hello? Carol, I'm at the house. I can't get in. What's going on?" There was a pause. Short, but heavy. "Oh, Emily. You should have received the letter by now." My stomach dropped. "What letter?" I asked, my voice cracking. She sighed, like this was all terribly inconvenient for her, like I was a child asking a question she didn't have time to answer. "Legally, the house belongs to me now," she said. "The will was clear." "No, that's not possible. Grandpa told me. He said we'd go over it together. He promised." "I'm sorry," she said flatly, "but Grandpa didn't leave you anything." Then she hung up. Just like that. I stared at the phone in disbelief, the screen still glowing in my palm like it had more to say. No explanation, no empathy, no, "We'll talk about this." Just a cold statement and a dial tone. I stood there for a full 5 minutes, not moving, just watching the door. I half expected it to open, for someone, anyone, to come out and say it was a mistake, that I could come in, that the couch was still mine, that my clothes were still in the dresser, that Grandpa's scent still lingered in the hallway. But the door stayed closed. The porch stayed silent, and I was homeless. I picked up the groceries, though I don't know why. Maybe I needed something to do with my hands. I walked down the steps slowly, feeling like the pavement was tilting beneath me. It started to drizzle, just enough to blur the edges of everything. I got into the car, my grandfather's car now, I guess, and sat behind the wheel, motionless. I didn't turn on the engine. I just sat there, holding onto a plastic bag filled with food for a kitchen I no longer had access to. I didn't have a backup plan. I didn't have savings. I'd been freelancing online to help with bills, but it wasn't enough for rent anywhere in town. Grandpa had always said not to worry, that we'd figure things out together. I believed him. I never imagined he'd leave me out. Unless he didn't. That thought hit me like a slap. What if this wasn't what he wanted? What if something had gone wrong? I tried to remember the last time we'd talked about the will. It was months ago, maybe more. We were watching a rerun of Wheel of Fortune, and he made a joke about needing to update his end-of-life junk. I'd said, "Make sure you leave me the armchair," and he laughed. "You can have it all, kiddo. Just don't fight your aunt for the china." It wasn't formal, but it was something. And now? Now I had nothing. No place to sleep, no toothbrush, not even a damn envelope. I drove aimlessly for a while. Not far, just around. Past the diner where Grandpa used to get cherry pie on Sundays. Past the pharmacy where they knew him by name. Past the park bench where he once taught me how to tie a proper knot for fishing line. Even though I hated fishing. The world felt too loud. Too fast. I felt like I was watching someone else's life fall apart. Eventually, I parked in the lot behind the library and curled up in the back seat. I used an old hoodie as a blanket and tried to convince myself that it was temporary. Just a misunderstanding. Just until Carol calmed down. Just until I could sort things out. But deep down, I knew better. People don't change locks by accident, and if she was lying about the will, I had no way to prove it. Not yet. But I would. I would find out the truth. Because Grandpa wouldn't have left me with nothing. He wouldn't. And if he did, then maybe I never knew him at all. The air in the lawyer's office smelled like old paper and lemon cleaner. Too clean, too artificial. I sat across from him, legs crossed, trying to hold on to some shred of calm, but my fingers were clenched into fists in my lap. His name was David Langston. Mid-50s, pale suit, thick glasses, voice like white noise. He'd been my grandfather's attorney for nearly 20 years, though we'd never met in person until that day. I think he was expecting someone older, someone more put together. "Thank you for seeing me," I said, trying to sound professional. I even wore a blazer I'd borrowed from a friend, though it didn't quite fit in the shoulders. He nodded and tapped his pen twice on the desk. "Of course. I understand you had some concerns about the will." "I'd like to see it," I said. "The original copy." He didn't argue. Just opened a drawer, pulled out a file folder with a little red tab, and laid it carefully on the desk between us. He slid it toward me with a slow, practiced motion. "This is the most recent will on file, signed 6 months ago, witnessed, notarized." I opened it. There it was, my grandfather's name in thick, confident print. The words, "Last Will and Testament," jumping off the page like a slap. Paragraph after paragraph of legal language that felt cold and clinical, completely detached from the man I'd known. Then came the part that mattered. "The house at 728 Marigold. Lane is hereby bequeathed in full to my daughter Carol Ann Jensen. No mention of me, not a single line, not even a token item or gesture. As if I didn't exist. As if I hadn't spent the last 5 years cooking his meals, helping him manage his medication, laughing at the same reruns every night. I don't understand," I whispered. "This isn't right." Langston didn't flinch. He just folded his hands and looked at me with that bland, unreadable expression. "People change their minds, Ms. Hart. It's not uncommon, especially in their final year." I looked up sharply. He didn't change his mind. He wasn't confused. He was sharp. He talked about this house like it was mine already. He said the attic was going to be my studio someday. Langston sighed, but it wasn't sympathy. It was weariness. Like I was just another grieving relative who couldn't accept reality. "Sometimes they say things they don't put in writing," he offered gently. "Or they make promises that don't translate into legal documents. I'm not saying it's fair, just final. That word hit me hard, but I didn't argue. I didn't shout. I just nodded, closed the folder, and handed it back. "Do you know who prepared this version?" I asked. "Was it you?" He shook his head. "No. Your grandfather made some changes last year with another firm. I was informed afterward, and they forwarded the updated documents to me once he passed." "Which firm?" Langston hesitated, just for a second. Then he opened a drawer, pulled out a post-it note, and scribbled a name and number. "Greystone Legal Associates." I folded it and tucked it into my purse without looking. "Thank you," I said quietly. As I stood up to leave, he added, "Emily, I know this must feel like a betrayal, but families have a way of hiding things. You may never get the closure you're hoping for." I nodded, but inside, something had shifted. I didn't want closure. I wanted truth. And the more I thought about it, the more wrong everything felt. 6 months ago, Grandpa was still driving himself to the grocery store, still making his own scrambled eggs with too much pepper, still helping me sort through story ideas for the novel I could never quite finish. He wasn't confused. He wasn't fading. He wasn't the kind of man who changed his will quietly, behind my back. And he definitely wasn't the kind of man who would leave me with nothing after 5 years of care and companionship. I walked out of that office into bright afternoon sunlight that felt too harsh. I sat in the car for a long time, just holding that Post-it note in my hand. Greystone Legal Associates. I'd never heard of them. But something about the name felt off, generic, like a made-up company in a bad TV drama. I looked it up on my phone. They had a website. One of those cheap, bare-bones ones built from a template, with stock photos of handshakes and gavels. No bios, no photos of staff, just a P.O. box address and a general info email. My stomach dropped. What kind of legitimate law firm doesn't list their attorneys? I clicked through every page. Nothing. No mention of my grandfather. No newsletters. No press releases. No social proof. It was like the site existed purely to look real at a glance. A chill ran through me. Was it possible? Could the will be fake? I thought about Carol. Her calm tone on the phone. The way she'd shut down the conversation like it was already settled. The new doorknob. The speed at which she'd taken over everything, like she was just waiting for the moment Grandpa died. Had she planned this? It felt crazy to even think it. But then again, I'd never thought she could be cold enough to lock me out of the only home I had. Yet she had, without hesitation. And now I was supposed to believe Grandpa changed everything 6 months before he died, without telling me, without even a hint. No, something was wrong. That night I went back through my old journals, texts, even the voice messages Grandpa left me when I was running late. I wanted to hear his voice. I wanted to remind myself that I hadn't imagined our bond, that I hadn't made it up in my head. "Hey, Em," one of the messages began, his voice warm and a little winded. "I'm thinking we finally fix up the attic. You deserve your own space, you know?" I listened to it 3 times. He said it. He meant it. And if he meant it, he wouldn't have written me out of his will, which meant someone else did. And I was going to find out who. For the next 2 months, I was a ghost in my own life. I didn't exist in any one place long enough to feel like I belonged there. I crashed on Lily's couch in her tiny studio apartment above a laundromat. Her cat hated me, and her shower never got fully warm, but it was the closest thing I had to stability. She never complained, not once. Just handed me coffee in the morning and let me borrow her laptop when mine finally gave out. The rest of the world moved on, but I stayed suspended, displaced, obsessed. I picked up shifts where I could, waitressing, dog walking, even a couple of gigs handing out flyers downtown. Anything to put a little money toward gas and groceries. But every free moment I had, I spent digging. Quietly, methodically. Like a detective no one had hired, investigating a crime no one else believed had happened. I started with the county clerk's office, scanning every will Grandpa had filed in the last decade. There were 3 on record. One from 12 years ago, when Grandma died. One from 5 years ago, just after I moved in. And one from 6 months before his death, the one that cut me out completely. That document, that version, that lie, I cross-referenced every detail. The signature looked like his, but it didn't feel like his. There was something tight about it, compressed, almost nervous. I knew his handwriting better than anyone. I'd spent years deciphering the sticky notes he left around the house. This signature didn't match the rhythm of the man I knew. I found the notary's name, Kendall Marcus. I called the office, disconnected. I tried LinkedIn. Nothing. Eventually, I found a private Facebook account with a single photo, a woman in sunglasses posing in front of a beach. I messaged her. No reply. I knew I was chasing shadows, but I couldn't stop. I started writing everything down. Names, dates, addresses, a timeline of how it all might have happened. The who, the when, the why. I needed to believe that if I stared hard enough at the pieces, they'd eventually rearrange into the truth. One night, around 2 a.m., I hit something. I was scrolling through property transfer records and noticed something strange. The title to Grandpa's house had been transferred one day after the funeral. That fast. Carol hadn't wasted a second. I double-checked. She'd already put it in a trust, then listed it for rent 2 weeks later. I clicked on the rental listing. My heart dropped. There were photos of my bedroom, my old bookshelves, my desk, even the dent in the wall where I once knocked over a lamp during a bad dream, all still there. She hadn't cleared anything out. She'd just posted it, like it was hers all along. I closed the laptop and sat there for a long time in the dark. My breath was shallow. Rage bloomed in my chest, slow and hot. This wasn't just betrayal. It was theft. She hadn't just taken a house. She'd taken my life. The quiet one I'd built with Grandpa after everything else had fallen apart. The one safe place I'd ever known. And somehow, she'd done it legally. Or at least legally enough. But I still had one thread left to pull. Years ago, Grandpa had mentioned a man named Briggs, Walter Briggs, when we were sorting through some old insurance forms. He said Briggs had helped him draft his original will after Grandma died. I remembered it because I joked that Walter Briggs sounded like a detective in a noir novel. It took me 3 days to find him. He was retired now, living upstate in a town with more deer than people. I called every Briggs in the phone book until I found his wife, who answered with suspicion until I explained who I was and why I was calling. Then softly she said, "He's not as sharp as he used to be, but he might remember." I drove 6 hours straight, fueled by gas station coffee and a single-minded sense of purpose. Walter lived in a modest farmhouse with peeling paint and wind chimes that sang mournfully in the breeze. He answered the door slowly, leaning on a cane, thin, tired eyes. But when I told him my grandfather's name, something lit up in his face. "James Hart," he said. "Now there's a name I haven't heard in a while." He invited me in. The living room was filled with books and a wood-burning stove that made the air smell like pine and ash. We sat down, and I told him everything. From the funeral, to the will, to the feeling that something didn't add up. He nodded along quietly. When I finished, he looked at me and said, "Your grandfather was a good man. Sharp, honest. He loved you, that much was clear." "Do you remember helping him with a will?" I asked, barely breathing. He nodded. "Sure do. That was... what, 2 years ago? Maybe 3. He was very particular about it. Wanted everything spelled out exactly. Said he didn't trust Carol to play fair, in his words." My heart thudded in my chest. "Did he leave the house to me?" I asked. "Yes. The house, the contents, the car. He even mentioned that attic of his. Said you were turning it into some kind of studio." A lump formed in my throat. "Do you have a copy?" I asked, my voice cracking. Walter shook his head. "No. I sent the official copy back with your grandfather, sealed. I only kept a reference number in my files. I don't store client wills anymore. Too much liability." He stood up slowly and shuffled over to an old filing cabinet in the corner. It creaked open, and he flipped through folders labeled in thick marker. After a minute, he pulled one out. "Here it is," he said. "Will 2402H, James L. Hart, drafted June 21st, 2022. He handed me a slip of paper with the reference number, the date, and his notary seal. It wasn't a smoking gun. Not yet. But it was real. Proof that another will had existed. Proof that Grandpa had wanted me to have the house. So where was it? Destroyed? Hidden? Replaced? And by who? Walter looked at me with sad eyes. "I'm sorry I can't do more, Emily. But if someone tampered with that document, it's not just unethical, it's criminal." "I know," I said, "and I'm going to find out who did it." I drove back to the city in the dark, headlights cutting through rain like a blade. The truth wasn't buried, it was just hiding. And now I had the shovel. Back at Lily's apartment, I was down to my last box. Just one cardboard container with a dented corner and my name scrawled on the top in Grandpa's handwriting. It sat for weeks in the corner of the living room, untouched, mostly because I couldn't face the weight of it. Not physical weight, but emotional. It held pieces of a life that no longer existed, fragments of a home I'd been locked out of, reminders of a man I'd lost. That night, it was raining again. A soft, persistent drizzle tapping against the windows like someone whispering at the glass. Lily was working a night shift, and I was alone with my thoughts and the sound of the city breathing outside. I opened the box, half dreading what I'd find. Books, mostly. Grandpa's old war memoirs, some paperbacks I'd left in the attic, a few of my journals, warped slightly from humidity. Underneath it all, there were a few of Grandpa's notebooks. Spirals with yellowed pages, notes scribbled in the margins, phone numbers he never saved to his flip phone. I turned the pages slowly, just looking, touching, remembering. That's when it happened. One of the hardcovers, The Old Man and the Sea, slipped from the stack and landed on the floor with a soft thump. When I bent to pick it up, the book fell open, as if guided by something unseen. And there, nestled between pages 112 and 113, was a cream-colored envelope. I froze. My name was written across the front in looping, familiar script. Emily. It was unmistakably Grandpa's handwriting. Bold, but elegant. Steady, even at his age. My hands trembled as I reached for it. There was no seal, just a fold. I opened it gently, carefully, like it might disintegrate if I wasn't soft enough. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper, torn from one of the very notebooks I'd just been flipping through. The letter was short, but every word burned into my brain like fire on paper. Emily, if anything happens and things don't seem right, look for the 1984 file. You'll know. Where? Don't trust Carol. Love always, G. I read it 3 times, then a 4th. My eyes welled up. I could hear his voice in every word. That slight gravel in his tone when he got serious. The way he always signed off letters and cards with just G, not Grandpa, not Gramps, just G, and the line, "You'll know where." It stuck with me. The 1984 file. What could that mean? I tried to think. 1984 wasn't a special year for me. I wasn't even born yet. But Grandpa used to mention it. He always said that was the year everything went to hell in Washington, whatever that meant. He had a sarcastic way of talking about politics, and he loved using years like metaphors. But this felt different. This was specific. Concrete. A breadcrumb. I turned the letter over. Nothing on the back. No hidden codes or cryptic symbols. Just his words, his warning. I laid the paper flat and stared at it like it might blink back. Then it hit me. The safety deposit box. A few years ago, Grandpa told me a story. One of those rambling Sunday morning tales over pancakes and 2 strong coffee. He said he once helped a friend from the army hide his savings during a nasty divorce. They opened a safety deposit box under a pseudonym to keep things off the radar. The name stuck with me because it sounded like a character from a spy novel, George T. Simmons. He used to joke about it. "Old George keeps my secrets safe," he'd say with a wink. I thought he was being dramatic, maybe even making it up. But now, holding this letter, I knew he wasn't. That box still existed. And I knew exactly where it was. Back when Grandpa had his hip surgery, I took him to the bank, First Western on 3rd and Hillcrest. He spent almost an hour in the vault room, said he needed to organize a few things. When I teased him about stashing gold bars, he grinned and said, "Something better, something." I never thought about it again. Until now. I grabbed my coat, ignoring the fact that it was nearly 10 p.m. The bank would be closed, but I needed to see it, to know it was real. I walked 3 blocks in the rain, my sneakers soaked through by the time I reached the building. The glass doors reflected my shape, tired, damp, but electric with purpose. Through the window, I saw the vault entrance, stainless steel, sealed tight behind layers of security. Untouchable. For now. But I knew I'd be back, first thing in the morning, and I'd bring everything I had. The letter, the name, the fire in my chest that refused to go out. Back at Lily's, I couldn't sleep. I lay on the couch with Grandpa's letter on my chest, feeling its weight like a stone. Not heavy, but solid. Real. Like an anchor keeping me from drifting into despair. He had known. He had planned for this. Some part of him had seen the storm coming. Maybe Carol had said something. Maybe he saw it in her eyes. The same coldness I'd felt at the funeral. Whatever the reason, he hadn't just left me a warning. He'd left me a trail. And at the end of that trail might be the truth. The real will. The real story. The final word from the man who had raised me when the world turned its back. I folded the letter carefully, slipped it back into the envelope, and placed it in my backpack, next to the slip of paper Walter Briggs had given me. 2 small fragments of a larger puzzle. My hands were shaking again, but not from fear, from clarity. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't lost. I had a mission. The next morning, I arrived at First Western Bank before the doors even opened. The streets were still damp from the night's rain, and the air smelled of asphalt and anticipation. I stood there, clutching my backpack, rehearsing the plan in my head a dozen times. When the security guard finally unlocked the doors, I walked in like I belonged there. I approached the counter calmly, but my heart was pounding in my ears. "I'm here to access a deposit box," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Box number 114, under the name George T. Simmons." The clerk barely looked up. "Do you have the key?" I nodded and pulled it out of my pocket. It was attached to a small brass tag Grandpa had kept in his drawer labeled spare parts. Funny how something so ordinary could hold the power to shift an entire future. "Do you have ID?" That was the part I was worried about. I handed over an old driver's license. It wasn't mine. It was one Grandpa had made years ago, part of one of his many eccentric jokes. He had gone all out with it. Lamination, signature, even a dorky photo of himself with a mustache drawn on. George T. Simmons, retired Army captain. We used to laugh about it all the time. Back then, it was just a harmless gag. Now, it was my ticket in. The woman looked at it, then at me. She hesitated, just for a moment. Then she nodded and typed something into her computer. "Please follow me." I felt lightheaded as she led me down the hall and into the vault. My palms were sweating. The air grew colder, more sterile. My boots echoed softly against the marble tiles. The metal box sat inside a small locked drawer. She inserted a master key, and I used mine to open it. She left me alone. I stared at the box like it might explode. Then I opened it. Inside was a sealed envelope, thick, cream-colored. It had weight, substance. My hands shook as I pulled it out. The outside was stamped with a notary seal. My name was written across the flap in Grandpa's handwriting. Just beneath the envelope, there were a few more items. An old pocket watch, a photo of Grandpa and me fishing when I was 10, and a black, velvet pouch I recognized instantly, his coin collection. But my focus was on the envelope. I opened it slowly, reverently. Inside, a certified last will and testament, dated 18 months ago. My heart stopped. It was all there. His signature, the notary's stamp. Multiple pages, each one initialed and signed in his steady hand. The language was formal, but the message was clear. I leave my primary residence, located at 241 Crescent Lane, to my granddaughter, Emily Rose Hargrove. I leave my savings, totaling $147,200, to Emily Rose Hargrove. I leave my antique coin collection, currently stored in safety deposit box 114, to Emily Rose Hargrove. She has been my companion, caretaker, and sole source of joy in the last years of my life. I trust her beyond all others. I couldn't breathe. I sat down on the cold metal bench, the document shaking in my hands. Tears streamed down my face. This time I doubted myself. Let Carol's words creep in and poison the truth. But Grandpa hadn't changed. He hadn't forgotten me. He'd planned for me, protected me, just in his own quiet, clever way. I pressed the will to my chest and cried, right there in that sterile vault, surrounded by metal and marble and secrets. But as the tears dried, another thought took root. The lawyer, Carol, the other will, dated just 6 months ago. Why would Grandpa rewrite it? Answer: he wouldn't, unless someone else did it for him. I took the envelope and the documents and walked out of that bank with something new burning inside me. Not just grief, not just relief. Rage. I made an appointment with a new attorney the very next day. A woman named Nina Morales, who specialized in probate litigation and estate disputes. Her office was small but modern, tucked above a bakery downtown. She greeted me with warm eyes and a firm handshake. I handed her everything, both wills, the letter from Grandpa, the timeline of events. She read silently for what felt like hours. Then she leaned back in her chair. "Emily," she said carefully, "what you have here is very serious." I nodded. "Which one is real?" She didn't answer right away. "Legally," she said, "the most recent valid will usually takes precedence. But the key word is valid." I frowned. "So the newer one might not count?" "If we can prove fraud, coercion, or undue influence, yes," she said. "Then the older will can be reinstated, especially if it's clear and notarized, like this one." She tapped the 18-month-old will, the real one, with her pen. "But why would someone fake a newer one?" I asked, even though the answer was sitting heavy in my chest. "Money," she said simply. "Control. Maybe your aunt thought she could get away with it. Maybe she convinced herself your grandfather wasn't thinking clearly. That happens more often than you think." I clenched my fists. "But he was thinking clearly," I whispered. "He was more lucid than I've ever seen him. Right up until the end." She nodded. "Then we fight." That word echoed in me like a drumbeat. Fight. I had the truth, the paper, the signature, the motive, and for the first time since the funeral, I had something even stronger. Leverage. We weren't just chasing shadows anymore. With Marcus by my side, I had names, dates, evidence, and one very clear mission: expose Carol for what she had done. Marcus was younger than I expected, maybe early 30s, sharp suit, and sharper mind. He spoke in a calm, measured tone, but there was fire behind his eyes. The kind of fire that only came from seeing too many families torn apart by greed. She knew exactly what she was doing, he said one morning as we sat in his office. Let's see how far she went. Our first step was to verify the origins of her will, the one supposedly signed 6 months ago. Marcus pulled property records, medical logs, even phone call transcripts from the hospice where Grandpa had spent his final days. Then we hit something interesting. Carol had paid a visit to Grandpa's primary care physician just 2 weeks before the alleged will was signed. She wasn't visiting with Grandpa. She had gone alone. According to the doctor's notes, Marcus, read them aloud in that soft, clinical voice. Carol had inquired about dementia progression. She asked how such a diagnosis would affect a will, whether a person could legally sign something if their mind was slipping. She was testing the waters, trying to pre-clear the fraud. But on paper, she'd claimed Grandpa was of sound mind when he signed the new will. She'd even brought in a notary and 2 witnesses, both her co-workers from the insurance firm she managed. It was too clean, too staged. So Marcus took a bold step. We hired a forensic handwriting expert, an older gentleman named Dr. Langdon, with half-moon glasses and a file folder full of magnified ink samples. He compared the signature on Carol's version of the will to known samples of Grandpa's writing from over the years. Birthday cards, checks, a short letter to a neighbor, the Maya. Verdict came swiftly. "It's an imitation," Dr. Langdon said flatly. A careful one, but still an imitation. Look here. He pointed to how Grandpa's natural signature flowed with pressure and rhythm, whereas the one on Carol's will was shaky, hesitant, almost traced. It was likely forged, he said, by someone trying not to get caught. Then came another puzzle piece. We subpoenaed the home nurse who had been visiting Grandpa weekly in his final months. Her name was Clarice, and she wore a light blue blazer and a quiet sadness when she stepped into the courtroom. Under oath, she told the judge something that hit me like a freight train. Mr. Hargrove had difficulty holding utensils near the end, she said softly. He could barely grip a spoon. Writing was out of the question. I never saw him sign anything after January. The will Carol submitted was dated in April. My fists clenched under the table. Marcus leaned in and whispered, "We're getting close." But then came the real detonator. Through a chain of calls and paper trails, Marcus uncovered that Carol had submitted the new will to probate after Grandpa had already passed. The signature date was backdated. Deliberately. When we confronted her in court, she tried to hold her composure. She wore a gray blazer and that same rehearsed smile I'd seen at the funeral, but now it cracked at the edges. "I was just carrying out his wishes," she said, voice tight. "I was trying to honor him." "But he already had a valid will," Marcus replied. "One that left everything to Emily, not you." "That's not true," Carol shot back. "He changed his mind. And you just happened to be the only person present for that change? No witnesses outside your workplace? No medical oversight?" She flinched. Then Marcus held up a copy of the notarized envelope from the safety deposit box. "This," he said to the judge, "is what a real will looks like. Certified. Witnessed by a legal notary from 2 years ago. Created while Mr. Hargrove was still in good health. This," he pointed to Carol's flimsy, smeared document, "is what desperation looks like." The room fell silent. The judge asked Carol one final question. "Did you file this document knowing it was false?" Her eyes darted toward her lawyer. Then, the smallest nod. It was over. Just like that. I didn't feel triumphant. Not yet. There was too much weight on my chest, too many sleepless nights behind me. But something in me relaxed for the first time in months. Like a thread had been pulled from a tangled knot, and now the whole story was starting to unravel. For the better. Carol was charged with attempted fraud, forgery, and obstruction of probate. The judge froze all assets tied to Grandpa's estate until further notice. But I already knew what was coming next. The house, the savings, the legacy Grandpa wanted me to have. They were coming home, so was I. The courtroom felt colder on the day of the final ruling. Maybe it was just me, bracing for impact, bracing for some last-minute twist, some legal loophole, some cruel joke from the universe. But when the judge read his decision aloud, it was clear. The court recognizes the certified will dated 18 months prior as the lawful and binding testament of Robert Hargrove. All assets will be returned to the rightful beneficiary, Emily Hargrove. The petitioner, Carol Lennox, is found guilty of filing a fraudulent document with intent to deceive and manipulate the court. I didn't cry. Not at first. I sat there, breathing. Through it, eyes fixed on the grain of the wood in front of me, letting the words settle like slow-falling snow. Carol didn't look at me. Her lawyer whispered frantically in her ear, but she wasn't listening. Her sons, tall, angry, entitled, stood up and shouted at the judge. Something about fairness, something about blood ties. One of them slammed a chair against the wall before a bailiff intervened, but I stayed seated. Still, because it was over. Had won. No, not won exactly. I had survived. I had endured. I had honored the truth when it would have been easier to walk away. I moved back into the house 2 weeks later. The locks had been changed again, this time by me. The room smelled like dust and old paper. The fridge was empty, the pipes hissed, and half the floorboards creaked like stubborn memories. Carol hadn't done much except box up a few of Grandpa's belongings and leave the rest to rot, but it was still home. My home. The first night back, I slept on the floor of the attic, my old dream space. The walls were bare, the insulation unfinished, but I felt closer to him there than I had in months. I lit one of Grandpa's old candles, sandalwood and sage, and sat with my back against the wall, legs pulled up, notebook in my lap. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I started to write again, just a sentence, just enough to feel like myself. Over the next few months, I slowly brought the place back to life, painted the walls, repaired the leaky gutters, planted wildflowers out back, Grandpa's favorite. The attic became my studio, just like we'd always talked about. I found some of his old notes tucked into bookshelves, little quotes scribbled in the margins, underlined passages in novels he loved. He was everywhere. In the uneven wood of the banister he built with his own hands. In the old wind chimes he hung from the porch beam. In the quiet strength of the place. Some mornings, I'd sit out on the front steps with a mug of coffee, just listening. Not for voices or signs, just for peace. And I'd feel it. That soft sense of presence. Like the air itself remembered him. Not in a ghostly way. Just in the way the breeze touched my skin. In the way the sun warmed the side of my face. In the rhythm of the trees swaying like they knew he was gone, but not far. People still ask me sometimes if I regret it all. Fighting so hard for a house, for paper, for proof. But it was never really about the house. It was about him. About the promise he made. The life he wanted me to have. The belief he placed in me when no one else did. Carol tried to erase that. Tried to rewrite a man's final act of love into her own selfish gain. But the truth held. Because truth doesn't disappear, it waits. Sometimes in safety deposit boxes. Sometimes in old notebooks. Sometimes in the stillness of early morning. When everything feels possible again. I'm not angry anymore. I don't need revenge or apologies or even acknowledgement from the people who tried to take everything from me. I have what matters. I have the memories. I have the house. I have the truth. And on quiet days, when I sit on that same porch with coffee in my hand and the wind whispering through the trees, I know I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be.